Hello, I'm Pat Arvidson, the Chief Strategy Officer and Evangelist at Interpres Security. And joining me today is Brendon Anderson, one of our Interpres' shining stars. A little bit about me. I spent 36 years in the National Security Agency as a threat intelligence officer, a cyber operations planner, a capability innovator, and finally an advisor to some of the most senior folks in government. And during that time, I was honored to stumble across a little program called Nipper Sipper Cybersecurity Architecture and Review. We called it NASCAR. And then we morphed it into the Department of Defense Cybersecurity Analysis and Review. And guess what? We called it DODCAR. During the time on that program, I had an epiphany. What we had been doing in cybersecurity was fundamentally wrong. Now, I'm not saying we as a community didn't do good work. We did great work, but we were always going to fail. Eventually, the adversary would change tactics and we would be had. The reason, well, hopefully it'll become clear, but basically, we've been thinking about risk the wrong way, and it's created a bias in everything we do. That bias creeps up in our everyday language. Here's a quote from an article published on fastcompany.com about how AI is going to save cybersecurity. Attackers can pick their spots and come from anywhere, while defenders must cover the entire vast landscape of their environment. They may spend weeks researching how a new vulnerability might affect them, and exploit might take months to detect. Well, to answer that, well, kinda, but not really. Keep that thought in your head for the next few slides. Or if it's easier, you can just say this. We have to be right 100% of the time. The adversary only has to be right once. Again, there's a lot of nuance buried in there, but we'll get to it. That bias, rooted in the earliest days of cybersecurity, 100% correct all the time, has led to the four things on this slide, right? There's no holistic view to continuously identify and prioritize coverage gaps, tool deficiencies. It's time-consuming manual processes for threat mapping, threat intelligence fusion. Readiness currently requires external auditors and consultants to produce reports and assessments that basically we can't really use, right? And siloed technologies and broken integrations provide no understanding of relationships, which is going to become very important as we move along, right? But what if we actually looked at what the adversary is really doing, right? My epiphany and the DODCAR NASCAR program started out on a simple question. Are we spending effectively to counter the threat? We didn't start asking about risk, but about threat. And guess what we found? We weren't. We were wasting a lot of dollars and resources trying to manage risk, but we were not addressing threat holistically. Sure. We see a threat, for example, spear phishing, and we'd go buy anti-spam filters and put dollars into training. Now, I'm not saying these are ineffective. What I'm saying is some may be necessary, but not sufficient. And some are not even warranted. Playing tit for tat is not effective in the long term. It's a losing battle, and it creates sprawl and inefficiencies. A lot of the times, we actually have the tools in the network to protect, defend, and respond to these new threats. We just don't know it. You just have to be able to identify them and enable them. When I retired from government and came to Interpres, it was because they were automating this process and taking it one step forward. And that's where we get these what-if questions. What if intelligence was timely accurate? What if we could get the most out of defensive investments? What if one person could do the work of an entire fusion team? 30 days of accepted risk became 1 day. We could minimize the likelihood of boom. Okay, I get it. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to talking about risk and bias. So, when we talk about risk, definitions at the top, you got it, right? In cybersecurity, we have a basic formula: risk equals threat plus vulnerability plus impact. Got it. But I like to talk about risk in an analogy, which I call Godzilla. Some of you have heard me before, have heard this little analogy, but I like it, so you'll have to suffer with me. Imagine a 5-story building. Let's change that. Let's make it a 6-story building because of some recent news. The first floor of this building is a security architect's. The second floor, security operations center. The third floor has your IT, business, and support systems. Your fourth floor, board of directors, corporate leadership. Your fifth floor is your customers. And since we've decided to add a sixth floor, we've added the sixth floor for the SEC and other stakeholders that provide oversight. That sixth floor is scary in its own right, not just Godzilla. But now when I say to you, hey, Godzilla's outside, and every floor rushes to the window and they look out the window, what do they see? Right? That first floor, it sees feet, and they don't want to get stepped on. That second floor sees knees, and they can't get kicked. The third floor sees claws, and they're sharp and nasty. The fourth floor sees shoulders. And the board of directors say, shoulders? Why is that a threat? The fifth floor see eyes and teeth, and they get scared, and they see flames and everything else like that. And the sixth floor says, hey, can we build a compliance framework? Now, when I ask you, or ask them, do they understand the threat? Each says yes, but they all have a different perspective, a different direction that they should go to counter the threat. The floors are not synced. They each have a different risk. So that's fundamentally one part of the problem. The second thing, what is this about the risk matrix, right? I don't even know where to go with the risk matrix, right? I'm sure it's a handy tool for people to understand how to use it, but green is low, yellow is medium, red is high. Is that probabilistic? Is that subjective? I'm not sure. I mean, if I'm driving my car to the store, does the insurance company pull out a chart and say, well, he's green, so let's reduce his coverage? Maybe, probably. But the insurance company isn't pulling in premiums from thousands of customers. So one accident isn't going to hit them that hard. So what's their risk? Green? Well, maybe, but let's think if they were insuring all of the houses in a hurricane zone. And a hurricane came. Well, now we've got a different story. Anyways, getting back to the formula, right? That R equals T plus V plus I. This formula was built in the 80s, right? We didn't even call it cybersecurity back then. We called it InfoSec, right? And the issue with this formula is not that it's bad. Its application was for another time. Let's start with impact. So impact definition is fine, right? We all understand that definition, the extent to which a risk event might affect the enterprise or the degree to which it will cause damage. Got it, right? That is a very probabilistic and subjective statement. I don't know how you get probabilistic and subjective together, but somehow it's there, right? 80% chance I figure this is going to be bad, right? So 100% of the time, it works 60% of the time, that whole line, right? And part of that is what I mean by some of that is only your company can assess the impact of losing your crown jewels. It's also what you're trying to drive to zero. I can't lose my crown jewel. However, just protecting your own crown jewels, while necessary, is not sufficient. We can briefly talk about the Colonial pipeline, right? The bad actors actually targeted Colonial's business systems that drove the gas production offline. Securing the crown jewels was not effective in preventing the impact. The system was not looked at as a system of systems, aka holistically, and because of that, they had a large impact. Ransomware follows the same path. The adversary isn't bypassing all of your external facing assets, it's going through those assets. They are conducting what we call an indirect attack. That is, they go in one way, they maneuver across the landscape to get what they want. Here's an example. Say you're in the natural gas business. The crown jewels are your ICS OT systems that control the operation of the well. If an adversary drove their car up across the street from the pumping station, they could theoretically use a Wi-Fi hack to directly access the controllers on the well, crown jewels. But in reality, they'd rather sit in their homes. I don't think nation-state actors have RTO'd yet, but maybe, right? Spearfish a remote worker and then maneuver through the network to place their implants on the controllers. That's what the Chinese did in the CISA JCA for Volt Typhoon. So again, protecting the crown jewels is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Now, if you really want to think about the Godzilla analogy, think about being in the room of the Colonial Pipeline and what each four was arguing about when that was going on. So within this risk formula, right, we talked about the impact. Now we're talking about threat. And threat is partly where the problem resides in our thinking, right? Basically, when the formula was created, like I said, we didn't have any data on threat, and also it was created in the 80s, right? So what we really did was say, threat is either a 1 or it's a 0, which is not accurate. And it's not accurate today because we have data, right? So over the past 5 to 10 years, threat data is becoming pretty good. And I'm not talking about IP data, IP addresses and signatures. I'm not talking about atomic. That stuff is, well, you get it's good for 5 minutes, good for you, right? What I'm really talking about are tactics, techniques, and procedures-based intelligence. You know it, we call it the top of the pyramid of pain, right? However, we know enough now that we can make operational profiles of APTs, ransomware gangs, malicious groups, right? CISA, MITRE, FBI, and others all produce them for free and lay out exactly who, how, and where. For example, the CISA JCA on Move It spelled out that it was a clock ransomware gang. They were targeting basically everyone, right? And they were going after 2 specific CVEs. Volt Typhoon, the PRC, living off the land JCA, is another example. But they were targeting Pacific Rim energy providers by hitting remote workers and then pivoting into the target network. The point being was that if you were not in the energy sector, or if you didn't have resources in the Pacific Rim, it wasn't a priority for you. However, right, if we're talking about Move It, if you had the software and the 2 vulnerability, then it became a priority. So since we're talking about vulnerabilities, right, let's really get into that for a second, right? It's interesting how important vulnerability intelligence is, right? And understanding it, right? So first, we don't need to have a discussion about what a vulnerability is from definition, right? The number of vulnerabilities is in the tens of thousands, right? The known exploited vulnerabilities are about 1,000. And of those 1,000, 2 to 7 are ever actually exploited or seen in the wild as being exploited, right? The reality is if you're trying to patch 10,000s of vulnerabilities, right, you can't scale that, right? And you're trying to patch 10,000s of vulnerabilities if you have the mindset that you have to be right 100% of the time, and the adversary only has to be right once, right? So again, using the Move It, right, there were actually 4 CVEs published with Move It. Only 2 of them were ever exploited. You didn't have to do the other 2, right? And there was no known exploit for it to begin with. So again, right, you have to use vulnerability intelligence to scope what you're trying to do, right? And you can't do that if you're in the mindset that you have to be right 100% of the time and the adversary only has to be right once. So within this entire vulnerability ecosystem, which is crazy, right, is how many vulnerabilities actually exist, right? So we talk about source code scanning, we talk about artifacts, we talk about containers, runtime vulnerabilities, right? Across all elements of production, staging, development, and testing, you get into the tens of thousands. But if you look at what is really going to kill you, right? You look at it from who are the actors targeting me? Where are they going? What are they going after? And you start to understand that, you find out that, hey, I only got 5 CVEs I got to patch. Now, it may be on 1,000 devices, but it may only be on 2, right? I can narrow, I can win it. I can prioritize at scale. So really, what we started talking about when we start talking about this risk formula, right, is the relationship between threat, vulnerability, and impact. right? We start looking at this whole thing and say, okay, a threat group is who and how, right? We talk about the vulnerability, we talk about where, and then we kind of hang impact off the thing, right? So risk, again, is really the relationship of the entire network, not a singular piece, right? You're not defending or driving down true risk if you buy a point solution for a single problem or to secure a single thing, crown jewels, right? We need to start thinking holistically about the entire network, about the entire threat. And this is when we get back to Godzilla again, right? If we understand the threat holistically, what it is on the outside, right? We're pretty good. We can start to prioritize. We can do some things like that. It all works very well until what? Until something breaks. And then the fourth floor asks you about it. Because remember, they're looking at shoulders and they're saying, what about this, right? And we've all seen these recently. The Move It is a good example. The Volt Typhoon, right? Some Citrix vulnerabilities, some other things they're scaling around, right? You get a request from the board of directors based upon either late breaking news or they heard from a buddy or whatever it is, and they want to know, are we able to defend against this? What is our defensive readiness against this thing, right? Now, here's some good news for you. We're going to see a lot more of these. Remember, CISA just published their strategy, and they said they're going to share more. Well, guess what? This is what they're going to share, right? What's the bad news? You're going to get a lot more questions, right? They're going to be questions of, did this happen to us? Could this happen to us? And if we don't get ahead of this curve, you're going to spend a lot of time determining your readiness against each one as they're published. Now, I've heard from some large companies that it takes them 4 to 6 weeks to do this manually. 4 to 6 weeks. Think about that. Got one guy doing spreadsheets and stuff like that, and it takes 4 to 6 weeks. The Clop ransomware gang gave them 2 weeks to fix their issues. Not 4 to 6 weeks. The SEC reporting, 72 hours, not 4 to 6 weeks, right? The time scale to assess defensive readiness currently, given the external things that are going on, does not work. So what happens when this really goes on? The fourth floor asks you, hey, what if? Could this happen to us, right? Proof positive, proof negative. These are the different terms I've heard from different people I've talked to, right? Well, the first thing everybody's got to do is they got to make a threat profile, right? Again, I got to figure out if I'm a Pacific Rim Energy company. That's the first thing, right? The next thing is I got to figure out how big my company is. I got to figure out locations, right? I got to figure out data types that I'm holding, PII, IPR, other sensitive data like that. And then I got to figure out the platforms. This is pretty simple, maybe 10, 20 minutes, right? However, can be very complex if you're a global company, right? Say you're a multi-pillared company where you've got real estate and you've got banking and maybe you've got some hospitality interests, whatever it is, right? Now it's a whole different ball of wax, right? Anyways, once we get that threat profile done, now we're into some fun. Now, oh my gosh, how exciting is this, right? Get out a spreadsheet, pick your spreadsheet of choice, log into your product, right? Look under your detection logic, take each one of your detection logics and manually map it to a MITRE technique. Okay, I got it mapped to a technique. Now I got to assess the severity of it, right? Then I got to figure out whether it's turned on or turned off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to do this for every single one of my products, right? Then I've got to go through each one of my telemetry. Am I pulling the right logs? Did this log get turned off? Did that log get turned off, right? Then I got to do all my products and look at my vulnerability scanner and make sure that's working right. And then I got to go through the report on the Volt Typhoon, and I got to pull out the technic IDs along with the technic names. So I've got to do mapping across all those different things, right? What am I doing? I'm building a relationship chart, right? So when the board asks us, hey, could this happen to us? You know, they're really asking is, hey, do we have the right relationships? Do we really know what's going on, right? Right? And then they're asking, is there gaps in those elements relative to threat and vulnerabilities, right? So at Interpres, we understand that cybersecurity is about relationships. It's all about relationships. It's about the whole, right? It's about the holistic whole, not the thing, and it's continuous. Adversaries, red teams, breach and attack simulations all attempt to exploit or demonstrate where those gaps are. However, this is a beauty thing, right? They're each a single point of time. So not to sound cavalier, but once you're hacked, you know what to fix, right? However, once it's done, what's the priority to fix it, right? It became a priority for you. Hurry up, remediate this, but are you really going to be hacked by the same group again on the same day while the hack is going on? No, not really, right? And don't forget about security entropy, right? Or as some companies call it, environmental drift, or whatever you want to call it. But basically what entropy is decay in a system, right? So sysadmin logs into a system and turns off the Windows event ID, or turns off a log, or does something because they're working on something and they just forget to turn it back on, right? Somebody spins up a Kubernetes platform and forgets to change a password, right? These are all things that your breach and attack simulation and other red teams are going to find, right? But they're not going to find them when they happen. They're going to find them when you call them and say, hey, can you come in? And then you find out that, oh, by the way, this log system that you were depending on hasn't been running for 3 months, right? That's fine, right? Trust me, this happens a lot, right? But in Interpres, we do this continuously, right? We provide a holistic understanding of the defensive capabilities and the context of those relationships, right? And those relationships are what are on the wall, right? The threat elements, the defensive elements, the vulnerabilities, right? So we do this, right, continuously, so you can identify the adversary's targeting organization and understand your readiness to defend against them in real time. So in a basic sense, this is how it kind of works, right? CISA releases a report, we ingest it. Within 1 hour, you have your detection gaps and you have your visibility gaps, right? You know exactly what you can detect and what you can see, right? Fix it. Manually, you're back to developing a threat profile. You're back to your spreadsheet. You're taking 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 2 to 3 hours. I've heard from a couple of companies, but that's because they had a dedicated staff doing it and they had a lot of money, to be honest with you. But good for them, right? So the point being is, if you can do it in an hour, you can be proactive for your readiness, right? This gets you left of boom, right? It gets you out in front of the event. So you have your deliberate process, which what we've kind of talked about at the beginning, but this becomes your crisis process that puts you inside the adversary's OODA loop. And I like to use OODA loop because it drives some people I know crazy. All right. So going back to this entire concept of risk equals threat plus vulnerability impact, right? That is for a singular system. It's not about the whole, right? Really, really about the whole is exposure, right? And exposure refers to the state of being subject to loss because of some hazard or contingency, which is basically the same thing as we're talking about impact and we talked about risk, right? But it's different. Exposure is the relationship of threat and vulnerability over defensive controls, right? It's about the system of systems, right? It encompasses the concept behind indirect attacks versus, hey, I've got to secure the crown jewels. No. I have to secure the business system. I have to secure the intermediary system as well, right? Because if they come through the business system and steal all my customers' data, I'm still going to get hammered by the SEC. Sorry, that's the state that we're in, right? So to help illustrate this point, go back to when I was talking about driving the car to the store and the insurance company assessed my risk as low, right? Well, when we talk about hurricane zones, they actually assess their exposure as high, right? In other words, a lot of incidents, a lot of homes being damaged by a hurricane puts the company at risk for losing a lot of money. And that causes them to raise their rates or get out of business. And that's what you're seeing in the cyber insurance business of today, right? A lot of people getting hit by ransomware. We're paying a lot of ransom. Our exposure is very high. So let's change the rules a little bit. Let's, active war. Maybe we won't insure people here. We won't do that, right? So they're looking at all of the systems as a holistic whole and determining their overall exposure, right? We need to do the same thing. We need to look at all of our systems and look at them as a holistic whole and look at them as exposure, right? So when we look and talk about things today as standalone systems, but they're not. They're interconnected, right? And threats do not come from anywhere. They come from logical borders with defined TTPs. We know this for a fact, right? They do it with the intent to move laterally across the network to reach their objective. We do not have one risk. We have a multitude of risks. We have an exposure problem, not a risk problem, right? And the key again is when we start to think about it as an exposure problem, we can start to proactively plan. We can prioritize the threats and vulnerabilities. We can reduce impact. We can reduce costs. So how does Interpres do this, right? Well, we're going to get a demo here in a little bit. Brendon's so great to help us with that, right? But basically, this is what we do. We integrate all of your defensive controls, applications, systems that you have, and we do that through a finished threat intelligence fusion activity, right? So we don't trade intel. What we do is we ingest intel from 22 plus sources, TTP-based, CISA, FBI, MITRE, etc. We run this through some modeling and analytics, right? And then we analyze and prioritize and optimize, right? What is your actual threat exposure? What is your fleet exposure, right? Again, looking at exposure equals threat plus vulnerabilities, right? And then we subtract the defense surface out of that, get your exposure score, right? So you get kind of an idea of what is my actual exposure to the adversary or to the threats that concern me, right? Based upon the intelligence that's being provided, right, by national sources, right? And then we continuously run this, right? So we know from the activity feed, if any security entropy happens, what has to happen, what needs to change. We know immediately if a what if question comes in, the boss says, hey, what's our exposure against, I don't call it Citrix, right? The new Citrix bug that's going around, right? Or the latest Citrix bug, how's that, right? We know immediately, we roll through, right? So you can actually do some pretty nifty things when you start to look at exposure management, right? As understand exposure management is about readiness, right? Proactive security, right? You have defensive readiness. We beat that one to death. We've talked about it. We'll talk about it some more, right? We talk about defense surface optimization, right? This is making sure that your controls are on, that are supposed to be on, right? You're combating security entropy based upon the threats that are coming after you, right? You're prioritizing your vulnerability shop, right? You're getting this threat intelligence that says, or vulnerability intelligence that says, hey, patch X first. That's the one the bad guys are going after. You understand why you're patching things, right? We understand that Godzilla now. And the last thing, stack and product rationalization. Find out what's working for you, find out what's not working for you, right? Find out what you cannot pay for and get rid of. Find out where you can find some hidden value. Well, that's kind of a lot of me talking, right? And I think the demo does a little bit better. But again, remember, right? You don't have to be right 100% of the time. You have to be right the appropriate time. So I'm going to let Brendon, one of our superstars again, take it over and give us a demo.
All right. Thanks so much, Pat. And as we go through this demo, Pat did a fantastic job of explaining why this unified, threat-informed approach is so important for minimizing risk and controlling for the specific threats that matter. And so how we're going to begin with that in the Interpres platform is implementing the threat profile that Pat talked about. So we understand that every organization is unique, and as Pat said, threat isn't binary. So we want to be able to represent that and create a lens through which we can filter and prioritize all of the various aspects of threat that might affect an organization. So as we can see here, industry verticals, the size, the geolocations, any controlled data types, and the platforms that comprise your organization are all going to inform the specific threat actors, the rogues gallery that's going to be focusing on you and is going to be presenting risk to your organization. Once we've developed this threat profile within Interpres, you'll be given a prioritized list of specific threat actors, individual groups or organizations that might be focusing on organizations similar to yours. You'll also get a prioritized list of the specific techniques that they'll be using against you and which ones are going to make the most significant difference and potential impact. And then also specific kinds of software, malware, or living off the land binaries that might uniquely affect the kinds of platforms that your organization is leveraging or might be deployed by those specific threat actors as they are focusing on you. So once we've developed that threat profile and prioritized the threat landscape for you, we're going to begin to integrate with all of your various security tools. As Pat discussed, the threat profile and exposure of your fleet relative to your defense surface is how we take a holistic approach to understanding where there might be gaps by determining the robustness of your defense surface and evaluating it against the specific threat landscape that's important to you. We can understand specifically where you need to fine-tune or improve your controls in order to account for those threats that matter. And so once we've performed these integrations, we'll get an understanding of your visibility posture, the kinds of logging data that you're collecting, and by extension, the kinds of activity that it will allow you to investigate, your detection posture, how all of your tools are supplementing and providing detections for specific pieces of attacker activity. And then as we integrate with your vulnerability management software, we can also get an understanding of the vulnerability posture relative to your fleet and how exposed individual assets are. And again, taking into account a lot of different factors, not only vendor scoring, but also whether or not certain vulnerabilities have been exploited in the wild, whether there's evidence of actual exploits, and then also how those end up playing out in the campaigns where we've seen them. And so speaking of those specific campaigns, and once we've begun to analyze your defense surface, your vulnerabilities, and your threat landscape, we can begin to look at that campaign intelligence to understand for actual breaking activity that we're seeing in the real world, how might it potentially affect you, and what's your level of readiness against the kinds of activity that's going on in that campaign. So this is a campaign view for the Clop ransomware gang, as Pat discussed, leveraging the MOVEit vulnerability. And we can take a look at this campaign and all the various elements of threat that comprise it and begin to understand our readiness relative to those elements of threat. So within the UI here, we can see the technique breakdown as well as the prioritization of the various techniques that are at play in this campaign. We can see 3 high techniques, 8 medium techniques, and 7 low techniques. 2 individual threat groups that are at play here. The vulnerabilities in question and whether or not there's any asset exposure, and then our detection posture relative to the kinds of activity that's going on in this campaign. So immediately we can get an at-a-glance understanding of how this campaign might potentially affect us, the severity of the techniques at play relative to this organization's threat profile, and also the defense surface and how well the defense surface is prepared to counter those techniques. And then we can also start to dive a little deeper and understand where the severity of these techniques is coming from and what are some positive changes that we can make to our posture that would account for these specific techniques. So we'll begin by looking at PowerShell and conducting a readiness assessment for PowerShell-related activity. Within a specific technique view, we can understand the elements of our defense surface relative to this kind of activity and how well prepared we are against activity involving this technique. First off, starting with visibility, we can see of the 5 categories of telemetry that will allow us to investigate and detect PowerShell activity, we're collecting 4, but there's one that we're not currently collecting. So what Interpres is informing us of is that we're missing a category of telemetry that could help us investigate PowerShell-related activity, and we'll dive on that in a moment to determine what positive changes we could make, which sources we could introduce that can help us to account for that. We can also look at the detection posture and see that relative to PowerShell activity, we're missing a significant number of detections that we could have enabled coming from our security tools. So that we can see that we have 212 detections that are currently disabled. We can also see the specific tool where these detections reside, and we can move into that tool and evaluate getting these detections re-enabled to enhance our posture relative to this specific piece of activity. We also provide reference detections to enhance your detection posture. So we provide a brief description of what the detection itself is looking for, and then the logic as well. So you'd be able to pipe this right into the relevant tooling, immediately enhance your detection posture as you determine you may have some kind of a deficiency. So that's one technique. We'll take a look at another. We'll go to ingress tool transfer. So activity involving ingress of specific tools being leveraged in this campaign. We can see we have two sources of visibility that we're not currently collecting that might help us investigate this activity. In this case, network traffic content and flow data. Let's examine what sorts of information we have about our visibility relative to network traffic content. And so we can see within this specific visibility category, none of our currently integrated tools are providing any context related to network traffic content. So we might need to evaluate introducing some new tooling into the environment to be able to account for any activity coming from this campaign. And we can also understand, again, relative to this specific technique, we have a detection deficiency as well. So it might be worthwhile to either investigate getting some of these detections re-enabled or looking at implementing some of the reference detections that are provided within Interpres. So as we move through the various techniques that are associated with this specific campaign, we can see how we can get an immediate understanding of, relative to the threats that are at play in this campaign, what sort of coverage and protection is my defense surface providing, and how robust are the tools that I currently have at my disposal in terms of defending against this specific campaign. We want to, again, take a holistic, threat-informed approach to determining readiness to specific campaigns so that defenders can immediately and efficiently determine what the best course of action is in order to account for the latest breaking threats. So this has been a review of conducting a readiness assessment within Interpres. Thanks so much, Pat, for allowing me to go over this, and I'll turn it back over to you.
So the big question is, when we get into talking about exposure and proactive planning, right, defensive readiness, right, we start to see that we can save time, we can save resources, we can reduce risk faster. Now, every one of these things on the slide is from one of our design partners, right? They are saving considerable amount of time and upping their security rapidly, right? So again, I want to thank you for joining us, minus the little hiccup at the end there, but the last thing I got to leave you with is, are you ready for what's next? All right. Thank you. Have a good day.